So our project, the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, has its beginnings in that moment of mass archival erasure. And the very fact that such a calamity could occur, I think, takes us into the complex world of communities, of identity, of identification with records, of social meaning of archives, and of forced forgetting, which in many ways you collectively have been exploring through this conference in such enriching ways for the contemporary sector. It was of the year 1922 in Ireland that the historian of memory, Guy Byner, recently wrote that historical oblivion, this is Guy Byner's words, historical oblivion is multi-layered. When examined closely, a hierarchy of disremembering can be discerned. And what Byner was interested in was how much 1922 itself as a political year in Irish history has been neglected and forgotten and suppressed. But his whole idea of a multi-layered oblivion, I think, is a fascinating starting point, a useful structuring idea to help us think about the long-term history of Ireland's public records, their purpose, their communities of reference, and their fate across time. The early public records of Ireland, if you take my own historical period, the 13th century to the 15th century, and don't worry, I won't be giving you a long lecture on the Middle Ages, but I think it's interesting to note that they are saturated with the language of communities that you have been exploring here. Community and its cognates, the Latin communitas, many other cognates of it, communité in French, commons, the House of Commons, commonalty, other words that are different semantically, semantically connected but different, like universitas, the word university, which is also from the Middle Ages, has the same kind of semantic root. Well, all of these terms, what they originally describe are forms of collective social organization. Political, national, royal, regnal, urban, religious organization. And these communities are the original creators of many of our public records. But there is a tension in the term, right at the heart of it, because it takes us to the question of whose records these were and what community. Later on, what public, the term extends into that realm, what public these records served. Archives and records, we know from the moment of their creation in the Middle Ages, as now, record information, of course, but they also encode or ascribe social meaning in the sense that they sometimes actively, sometimes passively, sometimes passive-aggressively extrude, omit, silence, forget, and protect for the communities themselves certain privileges and power. So communities in this early period can mean enclosure rather than openness, which I think has been the spirit of this conference in the 21st century. This is very important to understand in terms of the long history of Irish records, because it lets us place 1922, undoubtedly a singularity, the most calamitous archival event, but we can place it in a context. I'm going to pick 3 stepping stones through history to jump up to the period of the fire itself. And the first one, which I'll pick up, concerns an origin myth for the public records of Ireland. It comes from the 16th century, and the pen of the Dublin historian of the 16th century, the Tudor period, Richard Stanihurst, who has a sort of just so story about why the streets of Dublin have their names. Now, there is still a street in Dublin called Exchequer Street. If you see on the far right, the Exchequer is circled. Now, those of you who know Dublin will recognize the Liffey, but you'll see here the walled enclosure of Dublin is quite small. That's the original medieval city. And my university was outside the walls, over towards where Stephen's Garth is now sitting. The Exchequer is somewhere between what's now Trinity College and the city walls itself. And the castle, if you know where Dublin Castle is in the bottom right of that enclosure. And the significant point here is that at one point, the Exchequer and its records were held outside the city walls. And at a certain point in history, they moved inside the enclosure of the castle. They were enclosed. Now, Stanihurst has a story from his era, which is remembered from centuries before. So he's picking this up in the Tudor era, but it must be part of the social memory of his time about why this is the case. And I have his words here because he writes in this kind of quirky, shiny way that really brings the story to life. He says that in Dublin there is a place called Collett's Inn, which in old time, in the olden days, was called the Exchequer. If you know Exchequer Street, there's a pub called the Stag's Head, which is a landmark in Dublin, so imagine it being roughly there, outside the city walls and outside Dublin Castle. And what Stanihurst says is, if this should imply that the Prince's Court, he means the Court of the Exchequer, the most ancient of the Irish offices of state, would not have been kept there unless the place had been taken to be, he says, cocksure. So I think what he means is this is, in your words, a secure archival facility. But his story is about how this isn't in fact the case. He says, in fine, in the end, it fell out contrary, turned out a different way. For the Baron sitting there solemnly, and we do have this wonderful picture of the Exchequer in the Middle Ages with these very solemn grown-ups on the left. You see these bearded gentlemen. They are known as the Barons of the Exchequer. They are the judges of the court. You can't give me the excuse because I can talk about that picture for well over an hour. So I'll go back to Stanihurst. So the barons are sitting there, according to Stanihurst, solemnly and, as it seemed, recklessly. And the Irish, remember, think of Dublin as an English city, a colonial outpost, as it were. The Irish, spying an opportunity, rush into the court, where, surprising the unweaponed multitude, they committed horrible slaughters in the Exchequer by sparing none that came under their dint, under their swords. And withal, as far as their Scarborough leisure, Scarborough, interesting phrase, just means sort of a surprise attack, could serve them, they ransacked the Prince's Treasury, upon which mishap the Exchequer was from thence removed. And it is indeed the case, as I say, that at one point the Exchequer was outside the walls, hence the name of the street, and then from about the early 14th century onwards, it is inside Dublin Castle. But what isn't the case is that the story of the Exchequer's move has anything to do with an Irish attack. There's no actual evidence for that. So this is some kind of garbled misremembering of the past rather than a genuine account of what happened. So its value for us is as an artifact of social memory in the 16th century. So telling us something about how the past is misremembered, how the prominence of an attack on an archive can serve as a sort of peg for memory on which the past can be hung. And to the theme of this conference, very pointedly, we have here the issue of ethnic division or cultural cleavage between communities, Irish and English in Ireland, in stark opposition to each other. The attack on the Exchequer is, in a sense, an imagined assault by one community on the symbolic power of the written word protected by another. So communities are complex. If we move forward in time a couple of hundred years to mid-18th century, we find similar issues, that same conjunction of archival angst with imagined exclusionary communities in the Dublin Castle of the 1750s. When the Exchequer did move into the castle, that tower that circled on the far right of this picture, this is viewed from the north, and this is an early 18th century image of the castle, known as Birmingham's Tower, became, in essence, the record repository for the royal administration in Ireland, right the way up until the 19th century. By the 1750s, as is obvious from the picture, it was not in perfect repair. And Ireland had, by this point, already experienced a number of other archival disasters, the most notable of which was a fire in 1711 outside the castle, but nearby at the then Customs House, which destroyed the records of the Privy Council. So there was the smell of smoke in the air amongst those who cared about records. And in the 1750s, a committee was nominated by Parliament to conduct a safety audit. I attended some conservation sessions yesterday, so I know how important this type of work is. The committee, I think, rather enjoyed writing its report, which allowed it the opportunity to catastrophize in very vivid terms, a well-known lever on senior management and political actors when you want them to make a decision. They write in their parliamentary report, the Rolls Office is so crowded with records that a multitude of them remain in heaps on the floor. The whole building is in a most shattered and ruinous condition, and the records are an imminent daily hazard of being destroyed by accidents of fire and weather, or buried in a heap of rubbish. That's the report. And the response, I love. It's at the top of the slide here. Laconic, wearied, maybe mildly irritated, but worth jotting down if you are a senior manager. The Lord Chancellor wrote, "I am very sensible of what importance the preservation of public records in this kingdom have." And the subtext is, "and now go away." So this is interesting. The very word public records is used, mid-18th century, the term that is to dominate the 19th century nomenclature, and of course still survives in Prony at its 100. But whose records again? And what public? The 18th century public was an elite community, confessionally defined and bound by property holding. For this elite, records were literally their title deeds. They say explicitly their preservation is necessary to prevent vexatious, that's the term, questions about possession of land. So in this sense, these public records are, as Sir Francis Palgrave would later describe the Public Record Office in London when it was founded, the strong box of empire. That's my second stepping stone. The third is towards the new era of the Public Record Office Ireland itself. I'm coming towards a story with which we're more familiar. Founded 150 years ago. And at this point, Ireland really is entering a different world of record keeping. England, London had got its Public Record Office the Act passes in 1838 and the building opens in the 1850s, as you know. Ireland, after a fight to keep up with Chancery Lane, gets its Public Record Office at the Four Courts in 1867. This map shows this. It's also a way for me to appreciate the long-term collaboration I've had with Aideen Ireland, your president, because it was Aideen who first took this map out of the vaults of the National Archives of Ireland for me. You've forgotten this, Aideen, but it was not 5 years ago or 7 years ago, but 15 years ago this was shown to me. And it shows the whole Four Courts complex. You'll recognize this sort of cross shape here from above is the dome. The decapitation happens there from that quote earlier. But the pink area in the top left is the superimposed footprint of the Public Record Office of Ireland before it has been built. It's placed across a streetscape that will be cleared by the Four Courts Extension Act to make room for a new archival repository. So it's a fascinating moment in time. It's a map showing something that does not yet exist and which within 60 years will no longer exist. You can even see the shape of the planned building. Can you, from where you are sitting, see that it's in two sections, a front section here, which would be the reading room space, and this back section here, separated as a fire break, famously, which is the record treasury itself. Now I'll show some more pictures of this, but just keep that in mind. It gives you the geography of the Public Record Office. Here is the building once it was built. This front section here still survives. It's now the Court of Appeal. And this back arcaded section here is the famous Treasury where the records were held. This is the unique picture we have of the interior of the record treasury. 6 stories over a basement, holding in ironwork galleries the collected records and a glazed roof. We know an astonishing amount about exactly what was held where in that structure. It's sort of fascinating to me, really, that this is our only actual photographic evidence for something that is, to me now, very familiar, having worked so closely in it. And here, the inside of the reading room. At Easter 2022, some of us had the privilege of re-entering that reading room, now the Court of Appeal, at the moment, the anniversary of the occupation of the forecourts by the anti-treaty forces who held it until the disaster at the end of June. And we had a session, a series of papers, which were attended by the descendants of some of these archival staff who served in the record office in the period 1860s to the 1920s. And I do think that the work, I hope this has emerged from the project, the work that the Public Record Office did in its very short half-century, 55-year life, was absolutely extraordinary in terms of the systematization, the publication, and the celebration of Ireland's public records. Extraordinary achievements. And some of these figures are, now achieving some well-deserved celebrity, at least within our circles of historians and archivists. Herbert Wood, who was the keeper of the public records in Dublin in 1922, retires in 1923, I think, disconsolate. But in 1919, he had published a famous guide to the Public Records Office Ireland, which I will talk about again. And D.A. Chart, of course, you know D.A. Chart, who goes to Public Record Office Northern Ireland, Belfast, to found the new institution in 1922, 3, 4. And for those who wish to know more about D.A. Chart, a little plug, at the end of this month, I think it's the 28th of September, Prony will be hosting a day symposium that looks at the career, not just in Prony, but the sort of intellectual interests of a really fascinating man of broad intellectual pursuits. So that's D.A. Chart. His early career and experience was in the Public Record Office, Dublin. And then, of course, the explosion. I won't dwell on this, but you do need to see the pictures. That is a blast hole in the side of the reading room that we just were in. This is the roughly where D.A. Chart was standing in the previous picture. And what you're looking at is some equipment for the manufacture of explosives. This was confirmed by an archivist from Public Record Office London, Ratcliffe, who comes to Dublin and eyewitness and then writes up and publishes the report of what he has seen. And he says clearly in that text, various pieces of evidence corroborate the report that the manufacture of munitions was carried on in the repository. And I have to tell you, I never truly could believe it until my colleague Kieran Wallace, Deputy Director of the project, identified this photograph in the year of the centenary, and it sort of made it indisputable. What you're seeing is a National Army soldier, a pro-treaty soldier, reviewing the reading room and the material left in the space after the fire. So this space survives, but of course the Treasury itself is lost. The people of Dublin are left picking up the pieces in the days afterwards. So picking up the pieces is my very neat segue to the second part of the talk, where I'm talking about the virtual record treasury of Ireland. What is the virtual record treasury? I think it's, I ought as director to have a pat answer, but it is, in the same way, it's difficult to define exactly what is an archive, because archives are both the collections and the human infrastructure, the personnel and the expertise, and the building framework and the memories. The Treasury is similarly mercurial when you try to define exactly what it is. It is a digital representation of the record treasury lost in 1922. It is a legacy, in a formal sense. It is a dynamic legacy, as in a living legacy from Ireland's state Decade of Centenaries program. It emerges from that framework. But I think it's also important in this environment to say what it isn't. I am a historian. You have allowed me into your conference, and I'm very appreciative of the honor. But the Virtual Treasury isn't itself an archive, but it is the expression of deep collaboration. And this comes to the point about communities. Deep collaboration with a community of archival partners and practitioners. Over 75 repositories at this point, at last count, with 5 organizations at the core as core partners. The National Archives Ireland, of course, Public Record Office Northern Ireland, National Archives UK, all 3, of course, intimately connected in their histories, even evidence in Ratcliffe, the eyewitness to the Dublin office disaster, who then goes to Belfast, as Stephen has told me, and plays a lead role in creating the Public Record Office Northern Ireland. And 2 others, the Irish Manuscripts Commission and Trinity College Dublin Library. We are a digital representation, I said, but we're not simply a passive platform that accumulates or aggregates information, because the motor of our activity is an investigative research team, historians, archivists, conservators, computer science, operating at the intersection of a number of, not even disciplines, but sectors: public history and academia, cultural heritage, archives, conservation, and so on, and computer science. And so when I speak to you this morning, I really do so on behalf of all of these partners, and on behalf of the research team and my colleagues. And in that context, I want to offer an absolutely heartfelt thanks to ARA. I don't really have words to describe my appreciation for the award of the Ellis Prize last year to the project and the partners. I think that single accolade has meant more to me personally than any other that came in the last year. We all cherish it. And the piece of glass, I got worried last night at the awards ceremony that I was meant to have brought mine with me. But it's not mine, you see, and we've shared it around amongst the partners. It spent some time in the National Archives Ireland first, and now it has travelled, the Ellis Award, to London, and it's on display in Kew at the National Archives, another of our core partners. And next it will come to Public Record Office Northern Ireland, and then circulate back to Dublin. And I have to be very patient. Eventually it will come back to our offices in Trinity, and we can put it on a mantelpiece and appreciate it. Well, I want to say a little bit more about the functioning of the Record Treasury. Sorry, these are the wedding photographs from our Ellis Award. Yes, I don't need to embarrass anybody in particular, but we were all very proud and happy that day. So the Record Treasury, what does it do? What does it enable you to explore? And now, for this audience, I'm going to do what I almost never do when I'm faced by historians who have slight impatience with archival structure. But we spent a lot of time working with our archival colleagues to try and create a structure that respected both the Public Record Office Ireland as a hierarchical system that had been lost, and the many, many partners' archives and their collections. I think it's worth teasing that out, and you can tell me how well we've managed to do. So this is now live. It's not a live demo, I recorded it, but any of you could go onto our website now, and you would see the normal website structure, information about what we're currently doing in this phase of work from 2023 to 2025. Work we did for the centenary. Gold seams is a term of art that we created where we're referring to full reconstructions that are possible of records lost in 1922. But you might also search, I've randomly picked a Prony record to demonstrate for something. And if you do, you get this kind of display where the digitized objects will appear. And now we're in a display for an object in Prony, which is direct replacement. You can see the hierarchy for Prony at the top of the screen, and also a little blue dot signaling that this has been interlinked with something from the Public Record Office of Ireland itself. We've identified the connection between a transcript in Prony's collections and the PROI's lost collections. This is basically our means of operation. And through the system, you can also click into that Public Record Office Ireland object, And you can see how we've reconstructed the PROI's own office hierarchy as a dynamic interlinked catalogue, providing the hooks for us to add any further replacement items to that same collection that has been lost and aggregate a series of replacements. And the system also lets us come back to the original catalogue, that's that Wood's Guide of 1919, and review exactly what Herbert Wood told us about this collection in his own system. So I know that was a very swift move, but what I was trying to do is show how in a few moves, and for the user, they don't need to know why they're doing this or what these moves mean, but intuitively, through the metadata structure, we can move from either a Public Record Office Ireland lost system into the world of our replacement and partner collections, or the inverse. Both moves are possible. Underpinning this, I won't spend too long on this, but I am happy to talk about digital things if there are questions. I attended some of that track yesterday too. Underpinning this is quite a sophisticated structure, where the front-end piece that we're looking at is the blue pillar there, the platforming pillar here. But we have a lot of technology underpinning it. And the key message I would want to make here is that in every curation step that we make, from the earliest raw materials to the most finely worked, publicly platformed materials. I see people taking photographs. That's so satisfying, because I made this slide specially for you. Yes. Openness is at the core of the whole process. Openness in technologies, openness in the way that the materials are disseminated at the far end of the system. We have used some artificial intelligence systems. There's a major project I'm sure you've heard of called Transcribus that has worked on transcription of handwriting. So many of our materials in the record treasury have passed through this AI model that makes the handwritten text itself searchable in the system. And we've married that with an image presentation standard called IIIF, I'm sure you're also familiar with, but I think it is unusual, possibly unique, at least it was when we first did it, to layer IIIF images with a automatically produced Transcribus transcription so that those two things come together and that the IIIF materials themselves are searchable. So that's a sense of the whole pipeline of information. What isn't in that image, and I would really be in trouble with the conservators if I left the room without making the point, is the primacy of the material object, the artifact, the document itself. It's a complete myth that digital projects remove users, students, public researchers from interest in the physical objects. I started my work as a historian not quite before the digital era, I'm not that old, but certainly before major digitalization projects were so popular. And the type of digitalization you do in the early days is very different to what can be done now. A completely different way we do PhDs now. I was almost told not to visit the archive until the last possible moment because I needed to read everything in print in the library first. And now those barriers are being broken down because students and the public can get up close to the physical object in its digital representation early. And it encourages, I think, those users to enter the doors and explore further. But we have done some absolutely wonderful work on the conservation of these records. You heard last year from Zoe Reid at National Archives Ireland and Jessica Baldwin this year about conservation work on the fire-damaged materials from the PRO. But there's also wonderful work going on at Prony. I attended Sarah Graham's talk yesterday, and more conservation work on these really important, unique early medieval paper materials held by Prony, which are among the treasures of the country, not just of Prony, are a priority in this phase of our work. And also exciting work at the National Archives UK. Again, I'm picking the early materials because I have my own favorites, being a medievalist. But what you're looking at here is a document from a Gaelic king who submitted to King Richard II in the late 14th century. It's a very important sort of constitutional moment in Ireland's history when the power of the English king has been recognized by that king. But the text was, in this document, basically illegible. But we had the privilege of using multispectral imaging to recover the text. And you can see, even from that distance, how the notarial mark of the person who created this document suddenly comes to life through this process. So these are great privileges to be able to get up close and sort of unveil these records, sometimes for the first time in hundreds of years. But a little bit more about the structure, if I can. Here is Herbert Wood again, different picture of him, and there is his Guide to the Public Records, which was our starting point. I can't tell you how naive we were in the early days. This is 2017-18. It was literally a couple of us in Trinity with a whiteboard and some markers trying to work out how to behave. And it was only through the collaboration with the archivists that manners were put on our process. I put this on the board because you can see me trying to work out the office structure of the PROI, but nobody had yet told me about ISAD-G. It was John McDonough who said, have you heard of this standard? So we have learned an awful lot about the rigor of your profession. And of course, the catalogue of 1919 wasn't an archival catalogue produced to ISAD-G standards, but it is hierarchical. And so there is a way that it can find a digital representation in our system. And so we did begin to break down the Public Record Office collections. The big offices of state have picked the earliest ones, Chancery, Exchequer, and Plea Rolls, into their hierarchical structure as it is revealed in Herbert Wood's guide. So that was one part of the job, especially 2017 and 18. And we turned that into a database. On the other side was the task, actually much harder, is to find the replacement collections. And the difficulty was not ever that they were hard to spot. The difficulty was, and I always knew this from earlier work I had done, one of scale. And that difficulty has not gone away. The scale of collections that can be used to replace those that were lost in the fire is still daunting. We still have to make difficult choices about what to prioritize and how to work to best effect within pragmatic structures. This is just one example, one early series of memoranda rolls, big series from the Middle Ages again, where there are collections in multiple archives, sometimes extending to tens of thousands of pages of transcription that survive from this one collection. And I put this on the board with the admission that we have not, in fact, made much progress on this collection. It has not been one we prioritized because there have been others even better because they were closer to original sources that we needed to do first. And I'll talk about one of them in a moment. These are just a hint of the types of things that one finds, the different categories of replacement. When I use that term, what am I talking about? These are photographs now in Wexford in the collection of the Hores, H-O-R-E-S, in St. Peter's College, Wexford, photographs taken in the Public Record Office of Ireland before it was destroyed that survive as facsimile in his manuscript collections, and the original records are lost. So these are particularly precious things, almost little specks in a sort of universe of replacements. But when they take us that close to the original material, it's very, very exciting. But this is more typical. Transcriptions, this time from National Archives Ireland, made by the Public Record Office Ireland itself. I know that's too far away for you to read it, but it's in English language. It's translated from the Latin. It's describing the document in minute detail, which membrane the text is coming from. And it was towards a calendar that was never published. So these were working notes of the Record Office, which survived because they were in the front part of the building where that soldier was standing, not in the Treasury. They weren't the office records that were being preserved. They were the working notes of the office itself. And this schematic is not for you to understand, but just for you to sort of get a sense of the dynamic flow once you begin this to accumulate both the Public Record Office Ireland collections on one side and the array of replacement materials on the other side. We have quite a complex universe of materials that is difficult to navigate. Now, I don't think it's that difficult to navigate when you're in our system because the structure itself just underpins it and I hope serves it quite intuitively. And I'm going to show this through an example. One of these gold seams I mentioned of note that was launched last year, the 1766 religious census. According to my colleague Brian Gurran, who created this, Brian is an amazing person, the greatest demographic history expert in Ireland, and works closely in National Archives Ireland and with Prony's collections. And he brought together this material on 1766. And I'll just show you a little bit of what he did. You won't be able to see in detail what's going on, but I'll talk to you and you'll get an impression. Herbert Wood, again, a starting point. But in this case, not very helpful. Here is Wood's guide. This is all we had to go on in Wood's guide. If you click to the section of Wood's guide where the 1766 religious census is listed, it's in a section called Parliamentary Record Office, Returns to Parliament. And do you see where I've highlighted there? Returns of Protestants and Roman Catholics. 7 words and a date range, right? That's it. So that is not much to go on in terms of a reconstruction. Now, this is what Brian managed to do. This is our browse the 1766 gold seam and browse first what the Public Record Office of Ireland actually held. And everything beneath where the cursor is now, you can't read it, but it says Returns of Protestants and Roman Catholics, the same 7 words. All of this structure that's unfolding here, which is organized by parliamentary bundle, and then by diocese, and then by individual parliamentary returns, which are keyed to an individual parish. All of this is reconstruction from other indexes and sources that survive for various reasons, and that can be sort of accumulated to descend deeper than Herbert Wood could take us. Now, this is a very fine work. We can't do this for everything, but when we can do it, we should do it, because it's so powerful. And what's happening now is we have used those new hooks in the Public Record Office of Ireland to latch a replacement record onto it, just as I showed you before. In this case, a unique, not unique, sorry, there are 58 of them, but almost unique, survivor from the fire, a salved record from the 1766 census, lovingly restored by Zoe Reid and Jessica Baldwin, and then digitized at the National Archives of Ireland, and now here beautifully rendered in IIIF for everybody. So that's to give a sense of the power of reconstruction. And it can be done multiple times. Brian, because we can see exactly the full scale of that original census record, knows that we have reconstructed over 50%, maybe 55% of the original material. Everyone always asks me, so don't ask me, how much of the Public Record Office of Ireland we have reconstructed. I don't know. We can answer that sensibly when we talk about individual collections or records or series where we can do the full reconstructional work. So I can say something meaningful about the 1766 census. I can say something meaningful about, for instance, the book that's on the table here from this picture I showed you earlier. That is the oldest record in the Public Record Office of Ireland. It is the Red Book. It's a nice story. I told you I could talk about this for an hour. The facsimile is what you're looking at, made in the 1870s at the Ordnance Survey in Southampton, survives. The facsimile shows us that the original Red Book had this image of the Court of the Exchequer in it, created in the early 15th century. And on the image of the Court of the Exchequer, on the checkered tablecloth that gives the Exchequer the name, there is a codex, which is the Red Book itself, pictured in its own vellum binding. That type of thing makes my spine tingle. I think it's so interesting in terms of sort of the archival mentality in the period. But that's only one facsimile. Every folio and record in the Red Book has been listed by earlier scholars because it was of such interest as the oldest muniment in the country. Sir Walter Scott, the author of Ivanhoe, came to Dublin just to see this document. It kind of had a celebrity in the 19th century. And so what I've done here, all you need to do is get a sense of the color scheme. Green means that some form of reconstruction in calendar format, or black means full copy is possible. So for this one celebrity document, we're at, actually can't do the maths, is it over 90% reconstruction? There are very few folios for which we have absolutely nothing. This is not typical, but it is possible. There are other series, and much bigger than the Red Book, for which we're getting up to 90% recovery. Now, that has to be set alongside those series for which, and it's absolutely tragic, absolutely nothing survives at all. But I just think we must focus on the positives, because I've been working in this world now for, well, certainly 15 years. And there are still surprises for me. I've worked with the National Archives UK now for 5 years on their early materials. Just see what's happening on the screen right now. These are original records that survive at the National Archives UK from the Middle Ages. And I'm still going down and down and down. That's the thing I want you to notice. They've all been digitized. They were carried to Westminster in the Middle Ages because of fear of corruption. That's why they survive in duplicate. And aren't we lucky that the Irish Exchequer was so corrupt? Because now, for the first time, and I honestly only really, this came home to me when I was preparing the talk, and I started for the first time scrolling down and down and down. I've seen these in, those list and index society volumes that describe minute detail. I knew they were there, but it's completely different when they're suddenly there at the touch of the button. It's an extraordinary collection that's now available. And it shows the collective riches of our partnership and what we should be celebrating. But, and this is a big issue, these records are Latin records. I can use them, it's painstaking work, but those who don't have expertise in training in paleography and dead languages won't be able to use them. And I think this gets to a final point I really want to make about communities. It was a commitment of this project from its earliest moment that it should not just be open in the sense of sources, but that we should be trying to encourage intellectual access. The records by themselves are, of course, wonderful to make available digitally, but we must give people the tools to access the content, one way or another. And just in this case, as an example of how it was done, it has been done painstakingly. By the way, that's a leather pouch. That's what we were looking at, that carried those records to Westminster, and the pouch itself survives, which I think is wonderful. And here again, in that picture of the Exchequer, is the pouch sitting on the table. So wonderful connection from past to present. But the team of medievalists who've worked with us, Paul Dryborough, TNA leading it, Elizabeth Biggs and Lynn Kilgallen, two of my close colleagues, have been working to translate this material. So here we haven't used machine learning. This is too fine a piece of work. They've been using TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative. So we're moving way beyond metadata. They're producing full transcription in English language calendar of these records. If you can see keyed in on the page, Lucan, Kildare, Dublin, but all in English. Anybody can access this text, and it's going on for hundreds of rolls. But it's also interlinked with the original manuscript that I showed you in its alternate representation as a TNA record a moment ago. It'll take a second to load because it's a big record, but here is the same record now in its original Latin version, the version which did not provide intellectual access for most people. But for those who persist, it's not very hard to start getting familiar with these records. The mystery begins to dissolve. The words Dublin, Kildare, and Louth, I think, are visible to any of you who scroll in. And you're seeing words here written probably as clearly as when the ink hit the parchment in the early 14th century. It's extraordinary as a collection. Well, you'll be glad to hear I am now beginning to wind up. I began the talk with that image of a monstrous hangover, the morning after the fire of 1922. I hope I'm leaving you with images that are a little bit more positive. This is the virtual record treasury itself, the actual virtual model that we made for the story. And I hope it serves as a sort of metaphor for the story I've been trying to tell, a story that traces an arc which, at its most basic, is a movement from closed and enclosure to openness, closed communities, records protected behind castle walls, records protected by their own arcane language and strange mysteries, archives imperiled because of their associations with external power. The strength of this project, I think, is in communities of a different kind. and a different ethos. Coalitions of archives from multiple jurisdictions, collaborators from across sectors, higher education, computer science, archival services, and most importantly, the community of youths who can understand that the collection that we've brought back together, and which you've just seen open up and unfurl for the first time, is their history. It belongs to them. Symbolized by how anybody can crack open the Treasury online and explore 100 treasures, such as this one from Prony, but also from our partners worldwide, returned to the very bays where they belonged until the night before the morning after. So with that, my thanks to ARA, my congratulations to Prony on achieving a century, and I look forward to more collaboration in the future. Thank you very much.